What types of terminology are used for wine and other beverages in Geonic literature? Well, that's something we're going to be discussing on this episode of The Jewish Drinking Show, bringing L'chaim to life. Welcome, everybody. I'm your host, Rabbi Drew Kaplan. I'm very excited to welcome first-time guest of the show, Rabbi Dr. Phil Lieberman. Rabbi Dr. Lieberman, welcome.
Thanks so much, Drew. It's an honor to be here.
Absolutely. My pleasure. So for those less familiar with Rabbi Dr. Lieberman here, he is many things. He is a social, economic, and legal historian of the Jews, the medieval Islamic world. He holds a BA with a distinction in economics from the University of Washington, 3 master's degrees in a variety of different things, as well as a PhD in Near Eastern Studies from Princeton University, and topping it all off, the cherry on top, Semikha from my alma mater, Yeshivat Chovevei Torah. He is Associate Professor of Jewish Studies and Law, Associate Professor and Chair of Classical and Mediterranean Studies, Associate Professor of Religious Studies, and Affiliate Associate Professor of Islamic Studies and History at Vanderbilt University. His 2014 book, The Business of Identity, Jews, Muslims, and Economic Life in Medieval Egypt, was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. He serves as if that was not enough, he also serves the U.S. Navy Reserve as a chaplain currently selected for the rank of captain, and in his family life, he lives with his wife, the amazing Dr. Yedida Eisenstat, his 4 children, and a wild Portuguese water dog named Argos in Nashville. We did, of course, mention the medieval Islamic study, medieval Jews of the medieval Islamic world, which leads us into our topic, which is discussing wine in Geonic literature. Of course, many people may not, although we have done one Geonic episode before, so this is not a first time for the show. Nevertheless, I do think maybe, hopefully, it will be helpful for our viewers, listeners. What, who, when, where, why, how were the Geonim?
Yeah, let's talk about who the Geonim were, and as you say, Drew, where they're from, and also talk about why it's really important for Jews today to think about the Geonim.
Yes.
So when we think about medieval Jewish history, right, the kind of close of the Talmud, let's say around the year 550, and the rise of Islam just a little bit later, it was back of the envelope calculation around the year 650, right? So kind of late antiquity, the early Middle Ages, right? Here's a factoid. Roughly 90% of world Jewry lives in Iraq. Okay, now, how did the Jews get to Iraq, right? Back with the destruction of the First Temple, right, back in 586, before the Common Era, right? There, with that kind of destruction of the temple and exile, right? The Judeans and are exiled to Babylonia, modern day Iraq, right? And when about a little bit less than 40 years later, they're allowed to return from Babylonia to the land of Israel, right? Many of them don't return, right? And so the population of Jews in Babylonia, modern day Iraq, that's kind of seeded by that first exile, actually grew and continues all the way up until like 1948, with the founding of the State of Israel, right? One thing I love telling my students is that when the State of Israel was founded in 1948, if you think about Sunni and Shi'i Muslims as different ethnic groups, then in Baghdad, right, the largest single ethnic group was actually the Jews. So,
really?
Yeah, so it's a very prominent population of Jews in Iraq. And so at the time of the close of the Talmud and the rise of Islam, demographers think that 90% of the world Jewry is living in Babylonia. And so, and actually what my recent book, The Fate of the Jews in the Early Islamic Near East, is about how the center of gravity shifts from Babylonia to North Africa as the Middle Ages progress. Okay, so the Talmud is, comes out of the academies, the yeshivot of Babylonia, and also the Talmud of the Land of Israel, obviously out of the Academy of the Land of Israel. And the heads of those academies are called the Geonim. And so those centers, the centers in Babylonia and the center in the Land of Israel, are really the place from which the Talmud and subsequent Jewish knowledge flows. And with the close of the Talmud, the heads of those academies, the Geonim, are continuing to answer Jewish questions that come up after the close of the Talmud, and maybe stuff that the Talmud hasn't totally covered. And so those questions actually flow from the smaller Jewish communities all throughout the Mediterranean, one question is like, what's the proper way to pray? And so in the ninth century, right, Amram Gaon, right, one of the heads of the academies in Iraq, Babylonia, right, writes the first Siddur, first Jewish prayer book, right, and sends it to Spain. So Amram writes, this prayer book, just like telling people living, way far out in the Jewish diaspora in Spain, here are the basic instructions for prayer. And
that's got to be no small feat. This is pre-printing press.
Oh, that's right. So actually, great to point that out, Drew. That those responsa, those answers to those questions are written by hand, and they're disseminated, not through FedEx or the U.S. mail, but through a kind of a network of postal service, if you will. And all along the way, they get copied. So the responsa come from Babylonia, and then
they're copied along the way.
They're copied along the way. Of course, they're copied because if you had a responsum, that's traveling from Iraq out to Spain, like that's great Jewish knowledge, right? And so along the way, people, go ahead.
Part of that as a fail-safe in case one of the copies didn't make it.
Oh, interesting. I mean, I suppose that's possible. Listen, some of the time, what we have is a question, and the question's written in one hand at the top of the page, and then the Gaon writes the answer, below it in a different,
like fill in the blank
script. That's right. Well, a different script, right? So it's a different writer, it's a different script, and so it's great when you see a manuscript. That's the original, right? We know when something is copied that the handwriting is the same for the question and the answer, right?
Interesting.
But where it's an original, that means like someone wrote down a question and then sent it in the mail. Now, by the way, one thing that the sort of Jews living in that Mediterranean diaspora do is when they send their questions to the academies, they send money too. And just as we think about
beautiful
kind of sacred Jewish institutions, right? We send money. In fact, the language that they use is very much the language of sending gifts to the, to the ancient, the Beit HaMikdash temple in Jerusalem, right? So it's kind of a sacred act of donating money. It's a donation to the academies. And then, so they sent donations and they sent questions, and then from the academies, they sent out the answers. Now, the other thing that goes on in the academies
so there's a little bit of a quid pro quo action. They also, I mean, it's not as if people are just asking these questions without any monetary involvement.
Okay. No, absolutely. And so not only that, by the way, sometimes the questioners will send requests for answers to multiple Geonim in different academies in order to shop for answers, right?
They're sock shopping.
I know, 100%, right? And so we have situations, I've actually written a couple papers on this, where, someone will write a question and then they'll get, to two different academies, they'll get different answers. They take the answer that they want. And then what do they do with that answer? They take it to their local court, right? Because we often think about, Jewish law as something that gets kind of, it informs our daily life. And for sure, that's what it is for them. But it's also like what we think of in terms of, how our business relationships are negotiated, right? For me, it's American law, right? If someone cheats me or I have an argument or whatever, take them to court, right? And so Jewish laws serve that function, all the way up. And I mean, you can still, ask for your business partnership that fails to be adjudicated by a bet din in the contemporary world, but most people don't do that, right? They'll go to the secular courts.
Right.
Go ahead.
Can I have two quick questions? One is super duper easy. The first question is, how did they come up with this name? How was the development of this name? What is it? How do they exactly come about it?
I think it's a biblical phrase. It's like Geon Yeshivat Yaakov, something like that, right?
Okay.
So it means like the kind of the genius of the Academy of Yaakov. I gotta look. But that's
right. So the second question is more material. So there have been no precedent prior to this for letter sending with writing, because because in Talmudic times in the Bavli, orality was highly valorized, valued. This wasn't done by writing, right? So this is a new innovation for the Geonim, right?
So,
and certainly the long distances across the Mediterranean, right?
Right. We know that in the rabbinic period, that people did write down notes for themselves, even if they disseminated, their Tanaitic knowledge orally, right? And what goes on in the academies is oral. But I mean, part of the problem is that as you extend out over the Mediterranean diaspora, there is no other way of getting the knowledge out there, right? So the folks who are living in, let's say, Spain or in Tunisia or Morocco, right, until they get their own leaders, right, they're just kind of trying to figure out what it means to live Jewishly. Right. And so that's why they're making those appeals by letter to the Geonim. And now one
I
thing
didn't
that
know
they
if it was technological. I didn't know if there's a
right.
technological advance that happens. They just have
So
more paper available or ink. I don't know.
So there is more paper available. Paper becomes cheaper, I think probably in the 9th century. Don't quote me on that. And that obviously does facilitate letter writing over long distances. But the academies are seen, as I said, in this kind of sacred role, and they provide that kind of spiritual guidance all the way out in the diaspora. But the other thing that they do is they train people, right? So in Babylonia, right, people are primarily involved in agriculture in the Talmudic period, and during the agricultural season, they're out work in the fields, and then for 2 months a year, right, Adar and Elul, so in the kind of spring and the fall, if you will, they would come to the academies and they would study. And what would they study? The syllabus is the Mishnah, right? And so the Talmud is, kind of explication of, discussion of the Mishnah, which the folks who had been out there in the fields had been learning orally, repetitively, right? So the academies train people. Now, over time, the academies train people whom they send out into the diaspora. And so eventually, those people who've been trained by the academies, they go out of the diaspora, they start answering questions locally, right? They found yeshivot locally. And so there's a 12th century work called Sefer HaKabbalah, which is not about Madonna, as I tell my students, but instead there's a story there about the kind of dissemination of knowledge throughout the Mediterranean. And in that story, the author, a guy by the name of Abraham Ibn Daud, Ibn Daud explains, like, there were 4 rabbis and they were traveling to a convention of rabbis, back in Babylonia, and then they get captured by a pirate, and then they get redeemed by communities throughout the Mediterranean. And when the guy ends up, the one who gets redeemed by the community in Spain, goes to the synagogue in Cordoba, there's someone up in the front of the room explaining the Talmud, and he's not getting it right. Right? And so the guy in the back, right, who's Rabbi Moses, right, which reminds us of the story of Moses, Moshe Rabbeinu, in Akiva's Beit Midrash in Bavli Menachot 59b, 29b. And suddenly he says, wait a minute, if you did it your way, then you'd be getting it wrong. And so the guy up in the front, like, wait a minute, Rabbi Nathan the Pious, right? As I tell my students, he's not Nathan the Brilliant, he's just Nathan the Pious. Rabbi Nathan says, wow, this guy who's sitting in the back of the room and he's dressed like, like a stranger in rags, he really should be up in the front teaching. And so then suddenly Rabbi Moses becomes the spiritual leader of the community. And what that points to, what Ibn Daud is talking about, is students of the academy who make their way out into the diaspora, right? So he's telling it all as God is pulling the strings through this, kind of, parable, if you will, or fable. But really what's going on is the academies are training people to help serve those local communities, and they become so good at it that eventually the diaspora communities don't need the academies, the yeshivot of Bavel and Land of Israel anymore. And so while they're important spiritual centers, right, we see the rise of local knowledge in North Africa. So we see characters like, Isaac Alfazi, the Rif, in the 11th century, right, writing a kind of digest of the Talmud, or Rambam, the 12th century, right, writing his own kind of, halachic works, right, in order to kind of supplant, in many ways, the centrality of the academies.
Hey there, I hope you're enjoying the show so far. A new segment we debuted this spring was recommendations. That's right, recommendations of beverages from listeners just like you. So here we go with a recommendation from Noah Schmutter of New Jersey.
Hello again, everybody. I am back with another beer review. This is the Cuvée des Jacobins Rouge from the Van der Ginsta Brewery. I'm sure I butchered that. but it's from the Flanders region of Belgium, where they are known for making sour ales, kind of this reddish brown kind of color. What they do to make these beers sour is they put in these souring bacteria like lactobacillus, which is the same bacteria that they use to make yogurt, which makes it a bit sour. And you might think that maybe a sour beer would be just a little bit sour like a yogurt would be. But these beers are intensely sour, tongue tingling, tiny bubbles all over the place, just incredibly, incredibly sour, and I think delicious. Amazing. Still incredibly, incredibly sour. If you're interested in trying something a little bit different, something different from your, IPAs or your lagers, and just something that's completely different experience for your senses, sour beer is definitely a way to go, and I highly, highly recommend this one. This one's a bit hard to find, certainly harder to find than it used to be, at least in my area, but you can find one very similar to this one. That's called the Rodenbach Grand Cru, and that's available in pretty much any decent liquor store. So see if you can find it and give it a try.
I hope you enjoyed that recommendation from Noah. If you yourself have recommendations of spirits, liqueurs, wines, beers, or more, please let me know. I'd love to hear feel free to send me a video or just audio of a 60 to 90 second recommendation of a beverage to share with listeners such as yourself. Thank you, and now back into the show. Please. So I mentioned to a large degree, maybe 70, 80, perhaps even 95% of the reason people moved throughout west of there was for financial opportunity, probably for professional opportunities, I suspect. I wonder, there's a lovely lady named Professor Elizabeth Lamborn, guest on the show a year ago. So she had a really interesting note in her book pointing to perhaps the reason for the end sort of the Geonic era, a lot of the Jews leaving Babylonian area was because of rising temperatures, sort of fewer yields of crops. Was that maybe a catalyst for a lot of Jews heading west, whether that was west towards North Africa, west towards Europe?
So actually, in the Fate of the Jews, I challenged the whole idea that there was a massive migration to the west. Now, I've just described. So I've just described.
It's a great push for your book.
Thank you. It could be a better commercial than this, right? So I have described a shift in the center of spiritual gravity, right? Some of the teachers moved to the west, but just because teachers move to the west does not mean that the whole population moves to the west, right? What I actually think happened was, yes, the academies did train people who then went to become judges in the local communities throughout the Mediterranean. And having just one person move from east to west can make a significant difference, right? So, I live in Nashville, Tennessee. The arrival of Rabbi Saul Strasberg some, I think, 16 years ago, really changed the face of Jewry in Nashville, right? This commercial for Yeshivat Chovevei Torah. There you go. But you don't need a lot of people to move from one place to another to change the feel of the place. And so I think what happened was small numbers of people did move, some for financial reasons and some to go and teach. But I think actually the population in Iraq was subject to a lot of other conditions that did make life worse for them, right?
Political?
Some of that was, no, actually not political. I think actually so part of it was exactly what Professor Lamborn has described, which is agricultural yields go down, right? And I think what happens, and this is actually, Thomas Malthus, the famous economist, had a whole theory that when times are bad, people have fewer children, the population atrophies, and so on, right? Whereas when times are good, people have, more children and the population flourishes. And I actually think that's what happened in the West, that as Islam kind of unites the Southern Mediterranean, there are enhanced commercial opportunities, and people who take advantage of those commercial opportunities are people living in the West. But in the East, right, in Bavel, I think the population atrophied rather than moved. Now, part of that atrophy is, as I've said, bad economic conditions, but part of it is also because of the rise of Islam. And what I think happened with early Islam, actually, this is, perhaps not going to be popular in the Jewish world. I think that there are many people who, with the rise of Islam, bought into perhaps for in order to kind of better their their circumstances politically and economically,
Hmm.
took on an emerging Islamic identity. Now, for us, we
When we
think,
say early, you mean 7th, 8th centuries, or
yeah,
even?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
No, yeah,
Okay.
yeah, exactly. The first
Hmm.
couple centuries of Islam, right?
Hmm.
So, for us, we think you can basically either only be a Jew or a Muslim, right? So,
Hmm.
how can it be, Phil, that the Jews took on this emerging Islamic identity? Did they give up Judaism and simply convert? So, okay, we can
Hmm.
define Judaism and Islam as separate religions and say you can only belong to one. But, scholars of religion would define uh, being an American is a religion in many ways, right? We have sacred times, we have sacred clothes, we have
uh,
answers to ultimate questions. And so, is being an American anathema to being a Jew? Can you only be one or the other of those? Of course not, right? So, if we think
Interesting.
about Islam in its early stages, right, not like we think about religion today, the faith community, but cultural, partly,
Hmm.
not a single religion, but instead a kind of a broad tent,
Hmm.
then in order to sort of
Well,
gain social prominence, in order
right.
to avoid differential
Could you
taxation,
say acculturated? Maybe acculturated to that?
yeah, sure,
Yeah.
exactly.
Okay.
But over time, I think that the boundary between Judaism and Islam becomes much starker, and people have to choose. Now, my support for the idea that
Mm-hmm.
until those boundaries become really stark, there are Jews who switch from one to the other,
Hmm.
actually is Geonic responsa, because there are tshuvot
Hmm.
there that describe people who live in one place or another, and they come back to a place where there are a lot of Jews, and do they need to convert back to Judaism? Do they need to be
Wow.
punished for everything that they did
Wow.
living in the other place, violating Shabbat, or all of the things that one might do,
Hmm.
acting, when in Rome, do as the Romans do.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
there is a population, I think, who are kind of religiously code switching. Now, in this, I'm also following my colleague Jack Tanous, of Princeton, whose book, The Making of the Medieval Near East, right, describes what he calls kind of simple believers. Now, those simple believers, to his mind, are people who, they just affiliate religiously, because this is the community where their friends go, or this is the community that, they feel comfortable in. He asks in the book, this is a great question. How come, why is it that scholars can look at ordinary people and expect them to have the knowledge that is otherwise gained in a graduate level or religious studies seminar,
Hmm.
right? Most people where I live who belong to one or another church, right, join that church because that's where their friends go, or they like the minister, or it's
Hmm.
closest to them, right? And
Yeah.
much as kind of Jewish elites might care a great deal about the different denominations and what their religious outlook is, most Jews belong to one or another synagogue for things other than the kind of niceties of religious outlook, of
That's
hashkafa,
great.
right?
That's great.
Right. So, so what I'm suggesting here is
Yeah.
that as Islam came on the rise, right, there are many of these, kind of simple believers, and actually
Hmm.
found language very similar to that. It's Am Haaretz in the Geonic responsa
Hmm.
that, that kind of straddle both sides of the fence. And then as Islam really sort of becomes independent, and politically powerful and so on, that, those Jews are forced to choose.
Hmm.
And furthermore, once you start getting attrition on the rural periphery, a few people leave the community, and then suddenly can't sustain itself anymore. They can't sustain a butcher shop. They can't sustain a
Hmm.
court. They can't sustain a synagogue, right? And so that means that the community drops below a threshold level and it disappears. So
Hmm.
it's not just that, like what Professor Lamborn has identified, which is like decreasing, agricultural yields. It's also this kind of atrophy due to conversion.
Hmm. Interesting.
And listen, I
Interesting.
mean, there are plenty of towns and villages in Alabama, or less so I think in Tennessee, although there are some in Tennessee where I live,
Hmm.
right, that did have thriving Jewish communities maybe
Yeah.
a century ago, and a small number of people move
Hmm.
on, and then
Hmm.
the community disappears.
Yeah, absolutely. So What's the outer bounds? When did the Geonic era basically come to a close?
Right. So I would put the end of that, right, somewhere in the 11th century, even though the academies do continue into the 12th, there's still people who, want to bear those titles, right? But,
they were not
the
as significant.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly into the 12th, but, once you see the emergence of, say, the North African communities, you see figures like, like the Rif in the 11th century or the Rambam in the 12th. Yeah, there are still heads of those academies, but they're not yielding the same kind of power. They're not writing responsive to get the same kind of play. Because why would you write to Iraq for a tshuva when you could simply go to the house of the Rambam, right? And he's going to write something for you.
Hey there. I hope you're enjoying this episode with Professor Lieberman. I want to break in and give you a sneak peek into next week's episode featuring Professor Claudia Bergman as she discusses drinking or not drinking in Second Temple literature in the world to come.
You usually don't just eat. Even if there's no alcohol involved, you have other drinks. You have fruit juices, you have water, wine, beer, new wine, alcoholic beverages are everywhere in the Hebrew Bible, not always seen as good things, of course, but they are mentioned. And here they are not mentioned at all, although it is said all the time that the people are very merry. and very happy about being in the world to come. Often we associate merriment and feasting parties with alcohol or drinking in general, and it just the lack of drinking is simply noticeable.
I hope you enjoyed that sneak peek into next week's episode. Now back into this episode with Professor Lieberman. So that gets us to wine in these writings. So when we talk about these writings, it's not, I mean, it sounds like a lot of this is this rabbinic response that people are sending and then getting responses back. But I imagine there's some other literature. So what have you found amongst this literature about wine or really any alcoholic beverages writ large?
Right. So that literature does, the responsa are kind of the biggest block of it. And that gets, I would say, the most attention among scholars. But there are a few other genres that the Geonim write in, right? One of these is kind of, almost a reworked Talmud, right? The Talmud itself is difficult to learn. And so the idea of making a more concise document that kind of gives you the answers, right? That comes on, fairly early, just a couple centuries after the close of the Talmud. And so we have a work called Halachot Gedolot that is, in a way, a kind of a mini Talmud. And that's a nice precedent for what the Rif does in the 11th century when, if you go to your shelf and many printings of the Talmud today in the back have the Rif's digest of the Talmud, and if you're learning some Talmud and you get stuck, you can just kind of flip back to the Rif and he'll help you through sometimes, right? So Halachot Gedolot in many ways is kind of designed to sort of help you through that, or maybe just give you the answers. And one thing that I found, so peeking into Halachot Gedolot about wine, is I found a word. The word is Nun Bet Yud Daled. Okay, we might pronounce that as Nabib. But there's an Arabic word, nabiz, which is, a DH, if you will, a vowel. And that word nabiz, it ain't a Hebrew word. It ain't an Aramaic word, right? It's just an Arabic word. And there it is in Halachot Gedolot. And it's juxtaposed with other words about wine. So, here we have a, classical Jewish text written in Aramaic, right? Now, the Geonim, write many of their responsa in Hebrew. They write many of their responsa in Aramaic, of course, language of the Talmud. And they do also write responsa in Arabic a lot of the time. But here in this halachic, kind of compendium of Talmudic material, again, written primarily in Arabic and sometimes quoting earlier Talmudic sources in Hebrew, lo and behold, there's the word nabid is right there. So it seems that like Halachot Gedolot is thinking about, what exactly, what role nabid is going to play in the daily life of, the Jews of
So what might you suggest the semantic range of this word nabitha is?
So that's a good question, right? So in one mistake that Arabists might make is say, okay, we have a word that's a good Arabic word. And in Arabic, the word nabid can mean date wine as well as raisin wine and so on, right? Therefore, that's what it means in the Jewish context. Okay. And so particularly like
so nothing involving grains.
So,
No grains.
well, so I suspect not, right?
Okay.
But one mistake that scholars who know Arabic and know Islamic law might make is say, okay, we're going to take this term and we're going to define it in terms of Islamic law because that's what it was in its context. But I would argue that when Arabic terms get brought into Jewish texts, they get Judaized, right? So that is to say that nabid, yes, in Arabic it might mean date wine and raisin wine. My suspicion here is that nabid is referring to raisin wine, right? Not bounded by the meaning of the term in Islamic law, but rather it's Judaized. Now, in this specific context, I'll just read you the Aramaic piece. It's I nafel chamra o nabida al lavusha b'shabta. Right. So on Shabbat,
wine,
you're sitting at the table and you've had something to drink and you spill a little wine or a little bit of nabid, whatever that is, right? Whether it could be date wine because that'll stain too. But I think they're talking about raisin wine because of the staining properties, right? They're clearly thinking about, are you going to wash your garment on Shabbat, right? So, you can just imagine them sitting around a table and thinking, all right, what is it that we're drinking? Now, the other thing about the other suggestion that nabid is raisin wine, right, gets to something that I've written about a little bit, relying on other scholars, and that is that Bavel, the cradle of these Talmudic academies, right, even though back in ancient times, we know that there was wine consumption there, and in late antiquity that there were barrels of wine brought there. Iraq isn't seen as an area where there's a lot of cultivation of wine going on. Exactly. So now raisins can travel, right? In fact, they can travel easier than grapes, right? Because they're highly portable. And so it may well be that what we're dealing with here is wine that gets reconstituted. Now, in the other Geonic responsa, in fact, there are a couple responsa that say explicitly what happens if you're somewhere where there is no wine. Right. And so, one possibility is like you're on a ship, and that's actually explicit in the responsum. But, when they're talking about a place with no wine, that may well be, Bavel, right? Because there isn't a lot of cultivation of grapes going on. So,
and this certainly happened a little bit later, a very short time later. The episode we featured Professor Lamborn on with regards to the raisin, and that was a little bit after Rav Amram Gaon's time, but far out in India, where that definitely they did not have wine, kosher or otherwise. They just did not cultivate that out there.
Right.
That was Rav Amram Gaon, right?
Actually, the tshuva that I was referring to was Natranai, but you're still talking about the same period.
Right. So, I mean, and just a little refresher for viewers, for listeners. So this has come up a couple of times. So originally I mentioned Professor Lamborn's episode, but she discovered this through a footnote in for our 100th episode. We had Professor Jonathan Sarna, an article he composed in the 80s, this whole raisin wine thing. So this has actually been going on for a long time, and even up until 19th century America, 20th century. So it's not only restricted exclusively back in those times.
Yeah.
By the way, was raisin wine this sort of reconstitute, taking raisins, soaking them in water, sort of making some sort of, I mean, you have a sugary, watery thing that you can then ferment to some degree, but was this first appearing in this period, this Geonic period? I don't know that there's a precedent necessarily for this reconstitution.
Well, so actually, we do see in Tannaitic sources, right? So early rabbinic sources like the Tosefta, there's a description of something called Yayin Shel Simukim. So that could be, wine made from raisins, right? And there's one other place that I found in Geonic literature, Yayin Shel Simukim is mentioned. So, it seems that
maybe.
Maybe.
But clearly, I mean, maybe okay, but it doesn't get a lot of airplay in
No, not a
rabbinic
lot of it, for
literature.
sure.
It
For
definitely
sure.
does not. But it sounds like it becomes a little bit more a prevalent, maybe not like widespread, but clearly it happens in the Geonic period, and that sort of sets a foundation for a precedent for much later. It's right now in the Geonic period.
Right. So the problem is that, if you don't have wine
Yeah.
for Pesach, what are you going to do?
You're right.
Right. And so that's
Right.
the
You could
question
get
that
away with
Nashville gets asked.
beer the rest of the year, but that's a little challenging for
Correct.
Pesach.
Exactly. Exactly. Right. So what Natranai says, again, in the second half of the 9th century, he says somewhere where there's no wine, right, you still have to drink 4 cups. So what are you going to do? He says, stick raisins in water, right? Because,
Wow.
the earlier sources, it seems like do think about it as a passable substitute for wine. Okay. He says the alternatives to wine.
It's funny because I was just thinking about Shabbat or Kiddush and Havdalah, but now this is high stakes. This is Passover.
That's right. No, you absolutely have to drink the 4 cups.
That's really much different than just a regular Shabbat or regular Havdalah. High stakes. There's very little you can do. I mean, maybe you have date beer if it's literally just the dates, fermenting out the dates, but wheat or barley beer is going to be off limits. Absolutely.
Right. And so Natranai says that the alternatives to wine, which include date wine, honey wine, and so he mentions these specifically. He says they are unacceptable for reciting the songs of Passover on them.
Interesting. Wow.
Right. And the strange thing is he says if there are no raisins, right? Because, so number one, wine is the thing you're supposed to use, right? You can use raisins soaked in water if necessary.
And then it originally is a grape originally.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. And he says if you can't do that, right? I think he says you do it on matzah. Right, which of course, right? It
dates back to Rav. It goes back to Rav, or he would sometimes do it over beer, sometimes over wine, sometimes over bread. Interesting. Okay.
Exactly, but you don't do it with those alternative drinks. You either do it with wine or you do it with raisins, and then if you can't do any of that, then the second level is doing over matzah.
Not having wine, that's primarily due to material reasons, not political or Islamic reasons, saying you can't.
I think that's right. Okay. I think that's right because Muslims don't prevent Christians or Jews from engaging in practices that they themselves wouldn't engage in, but that doesn't mean that those don't have to be kept indoors.
Yeah. I wonder also, I mean, I can't help but think, in societies where you have a greater amount of production of these things, it's going to be easier to find. If it's just up to the Jews, what if you don't have such a huge amount of Jews around? There might not be as much of a market, might not be financially worth it for people to really engage in that business. So it's could be harder to find that.
Right. So that also suggests that there isn't a kind of active transit trade. Right. And we know from the Talmud, right, that there is, kind of travel from Babylonia to the land of Israel, right? That this character went up to the land of Israel, this character went to Babylonia, right? It's all over the Talmud, right? But listen, if there was, kind of liquid, travel of commodities, no reason you couldn't find wine, right?
Yeah.
So this kind of suggests that even, in the 9th century, that maybe there really wasn't a kind of active long distance trade.
Or maybe maybe there were some more off the beaten path towns. I don't know.
Yeah. So that suggests, again, my theory that the Jews actually kind of remained in the rural periphery, even after Islam kind of founds major cities such as Baghdad, where there were all kinds of commercial opportunities. I think that a lot of Jews did stay outside the cities and continue to be involved in agriculture. In fact, there's another tshuva also of Natranai that asks the question, can non-Jews pick grapes of Jews on Chol HaMoed? Right. So, on Chol HaMoed, Jews are not supposed to be doing that work.
Yeah.
Right. And so can they have non-Jews pick their grapes from? Now, there are all kinds of laws, as you know, surrounding the preparation of wine, right? And so does having non-Jews sow the grapes or pick the grapes, right, render them unfit? So, like there are a lot of things going on there. One thing is that like, it tells us a little bit what Natranai thinks about the neighbors, right? That he wants to kind of draw a firm boundary. But it also suggests that it's really complicated owning a vineyard. And so, it may be the case that in Babylonia, the Jews really didn't work vineyards so much.
Wow. Right? What did he ultimately say? What did he talk about?
Oh,
what did he answer?
Right. He's like, no, they can't do it. Right. So it just like points to how complicated it is. Yeah.
Hey there, I wanted to break in. I hope you're enjoying the episodes so far. Actually, I hope you're enjoying all of the episodes, or at the very least, most of them. And if you haven't, and if this is your first episode, go check more of them out. But if you have been enjoying them, and if you enjoy the other resources that are shared at jewishdrinking.com, I hope you think about the opportunity of supporting the work that we do here and continue to do. Please feel free to visit jewishdrinking.com/donate, and you can help support the work and continue our mission and our vision of bringing l'chaims to life. Thank you so much, and now back into the show.
I mean, there is a discussion of, Shechar Tamarim, and you know that because that's in the Tosefta. It's also in the
so date beer,
Bavli, right? Yeah, the date beer, exactly. Yeah. And if I remember correctly, if you read, fictional novel of Babylonia, Rabbi Chia's daughter, if I remember correctly, in that novel, they have a date beer factory, and so that that idea is definitely popular from Talmudic times. Geonic responsa can sometimes give us a picture of what's going on, outside the major areas of Jewish settlement, right? And that's something that as a historian I'm always trying to do because otherwise historians are always focused on the literary record, and literary record comes from the cities and where the people are, then knowledgeable people and so on.
So urban-rural divide.
Yeah, as a social historian, I'm always trying to kind of pull the string on what's going on beyond the cities. And so, like the story you just told, like, all right, so outside the cities, maybe it was much harder. Inside, in Tesphone is like much easier. So I mean, I think you're right. And it's good that you can kind of put that nuance on the on that literary material. Otherwise it's very hard to identify where this is coming from or what this is describing. And so Geonic responsa,
bringing it to life, multi-dimensioning it.
trying, right? But Geonic responsa, they don't tell us where they're from or where they're writing to, because along the way when they get copied, they remove a lot of the details. Right? Because they stand as legal precedents a lot of the time, and they're legal precedents if you take out the details, right? Because, legally, you don't need all of those details. You don't need the names of the litigants or the specific town they're from. And sometimes they remain in there, and I try to kind of tease that out because it's really useful for providing that local knowledge.
I was going to say, especially if you're writing it all from hand. It's a lot more work. What do I need to do this for? I'm going to cut corners.
Exactly right.
Hey there, I hope you're enjoying the episode so far. I know you might think that Jewish drinking only exists on podcasts, but guess what? It can be so much more. Have you ever wondered how to elevate an experience for your shul, JCC, other organizations, even businesses? I'm more than happy to chat to see how we can bring that to you. You can feel free to reach out to me at drew@jewishdrinking.com. We can see how I can help you bring l'chaims to life. Rabbi Dr. Lieberman, this has been fantastic. This has been insightful, entertaining, edutaining, all those good things. Is there anything you would like to promote?
I would love for folks to read my new book, The Fate of the Jews in the Early Islamic Near East, published by Cambridge University Press in 2022.
Wonderful.
And you can look for my translation of the Guide to the Perplexed, which I composed along with my Vanderbilt colleague, Len Goodman.
When is that coming out?
Who is a philosopher. That will come out in 2023 from Stanford University Press.
What prompted you to create a new translation rather than the Pines?
Right. So that is a great question.
That's why I asked it.
Yeah. So Shlomo Pinas' translation is 50 years old. And 50 years is not enough to necessarily require a new translation. But Pinas's...
It's very cumbersome language, right?
That is intentional.
Oh, really?
It is intentional because Shlomo Pinas wanted it to be, not that Shlomo Pinas wanted it to be confusing, but Shlomo Pinas was willing for it to be confusing because he believed that the Rambam wrote
Wanted.
on two levels simultaneously.
Well, I thought you were going to say for the elite.
Well, so he writes on two levels simultaneously.
Mm-hmm.
He writes on the level, that the kind of simple, Pashut Yid can read.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something for the elite that's down a little bit lower, right? And so by making it, kind of difficult for one to understand, he's a little bit covering over the fact that, there are contradictions that appear in the text because, the Rambam is writing at these two levels. Now, our translation tries to translate for the argument. And we do believe that the Rambam is writing for two different audiences, but he also believes that one can start, rather than seeing it as concentric circles, right? We see it as a spiral. And so you could start on the outside and you work your way in, right? But working your way in requires a lot of work. And so we translate in order to communicate the argument with the understanding that one will read the text kind of cyclically. And the second time you come to it, just like the second time you come to the Torah, the third time, the 10th time, the 40th time, right? You're a different person and you understand it on a different level. So you work your way in. Whereas for penis, right, those were two concentric circles that simply didn't meet. And therefore, there were contradictions in the text that could not be overcome. And so leaving the text basically incomprehensible in a way, right, was okay with him because he believes that the Rambam didn't intend it to be kind of fully comprehensible, whereas we are translating in order to communicate the philosophical argument. So
very neat. I had no idea about that project. That sounds very exciting.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Well, this has been fantastic and all those great things. So, l'chaim.
L'chaim.